Hi, everyone. I'm greet you today from my home office and dealing with a very frigid and cold February. And we're here to finish up with our discussions on Chapter 3 Federalism. And we're really going to, in this recording, focus on intergovernmental relations. All right, now we got it together here. So let's go through some parts here on intergovernmental relations. And first off, we'll focus on some very important court cases. So as you're finishing up with this chapter, reviewing this chapter and preparing for questions on this chapter, then consider some of the more important court cases. So on pages 102 and 103, you'll see many of these court cases. Any discussion about federalism will come back to McCulloch v. Maryland. In this case, you're looking at a national bank, the establishment of a national bank. Could a state then tax a national bank? And here you have a conclusion by the court, the Supreme Court, that number one, the United States can establish a national bank through the necessary and proper clause, and then it would be viewed as an interference on the Commerce Clause for then the states to be able to tax this national institution. So the tax was not allowed. The creation of the national bank was found to be constitutional. How should it be? How should any kind of infrastructure that involves more than one state be regulated or taxed? So could one state then tax a piece of infrastructure that involves more than one state? So a water system, for example, a bridge, some sort of transportation that would involve more than one state. And this is looking at the waterways between New Jersey and New York, in which you had states that were now trying to interfere with the other states in this infrastructure that would involve more than one state. When that happens, in the case of Gibbons v. Ogden, then it is up to the national government to do the regulation, not one of the states. So this is a good example of federalism, intergovernmental relations of one state having to then have the obligations to continue to assist or at least not interfere with another state when it comes to transportation. But we can also see here on page 103, United States v. Lopez, that establishment of gun-free zones by the national government is an interference to states. It's up to states to make that establishment if the states so desire, not the federal government. So that would be a case of a federal government. As far as the courts were concerned, that was not the responsibility of the federal government in that case. And in some ways you could say, does it involve more than one state? If there was a gun-free zone that was involving more than one state, then perhaps that might be a reason for using the federal government. But if it's within the boundaries of a state, then that would not be, as far as the courts were concerned, not the responsibility of the federal government. There were some other cases that were, one case that was in some ways suggested, but not specifically mentioned in your text, was in 1937, Helvering v. Davis. So this is not mentioned in your text specifically. So I think it is, though, important to remember. And this is looking at age-old benefits, as we refer to them as Social Security. And so is a national program for old age benefits constitutional? And the Supreme Court ruled in 1937, yes, And your text goes into some other details as to why it would be constitutional. It was reasonable to have something like this, but also what would it then mean if you had a situation in which benefits would be quite uneven between one state and another. And so if you had such an unbalance in that case, would it lead to a nationwide calamity? You know, that maybe all of that is an exaggeration, but you had a court that would say it seems reasonable to come up with some way of preventing that from happening, providing these particular benefits. And so it was found to be constitutional. But here's an interesting case, not mentioned in your text, but I think it's worth noting, especially because it also brings in the state of Oklahoma. And it's been a while now, 1976, but looking at the application of the 14th Amendment, and in particular here, an issue that perhaps has been somewhat resolved, looking at drinking age. And at this time, though, it wasn't resolved. There was considerable differences in the country on drinking age. And so here we can see Craig V. Boren in 1976. Boren was the governor of the state of Oklahoma. He went on to be a U.S. senator in Oklahoma. And then from there also went on to be the president of the University of Oklahoma. So there was a time in Oklahoma in which there were different legal drinking ages. So you would have had, for men, the drinking age was 21, and for women, it was 18. So to have an uneven drinking age was at a violation of the 14th Amendment. And this is where you have the court rule that it was a violation of the 14th Amendment. So this was, if you're often the reference for the 14th Amendment is equal protection under the law. So if you're seeking equal protection under the law, it's a violation of equal protection to have a drinking age at one level, at one particular age, for one gender over the other. And so it's interesting to see that involving the state here and its drinking age, that it was in fact a violation of the 14th Amendment. There needs to be a uniformed drinking age. But it does lead to an interesting question, and maybe one you can consider, maybe talk to someone else about it, or at least, again, write down in your notes. Can you think of any law or requirement that should be different for men or women? Maybe different between men and women, right? So should there be different laws for different genders? But that's another court case involving, in this case, the state of Oklahoma and the 14th Amendment, the interpretation of the 14th Amendment. And also, as we can see here now, going on 9 years, and has been an important court case also involving the 14th Amendment. United States v. Windsor in 2013. Same-sex married couples receive equal treatment on issues related to taxes, inheritance, and other federal laws. So again, the 14th Amendment, as it's oftentimes referenced, cannot deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. That's generally, there's other parts of the 14th Amendment, but that's the one that's brought out the most. And so in this case, is it an unfair denial, an unconstitutional denial for same-sex couples to not have this same treatment, as you can see for heterosexual couples? And so that was the ruling, and we can see there the importance of that ruling. And then for that to happen, it has to then apply in all the states. So this is not going to be an issue in which you can see different outcomes among the states. So this is to be an equal treatment in all states. Okay, so here on page 106, we can see the definition of intergovernmental relations. And so we can see that this is an ongoing issue that needs to be worked out in different ways. Which level of government should have the most authority? What does it mean when they share authority? When you look at this definition, how does that authority change? Lots of ongoing questions about intergovernmental relations, the interactions of two or more governments, national, state, and local, in their collective efforts to provide goods and services to the people they each serve. So, and that's what we looked at here with intergovernmental relations on banking, regulating water systems, looking at the potential for gun-free zones, considering the issue of drinking age, and then also on marriage. So, as we can imagine, there are countless types of issues and questions that can be raised that would apply to intergovernmental relations. So along that is that you have states reserve powers to protect the health, safety, lives, and properties of residents in a state, what's referred to as police powers. So this then raises an issue of, are there areas in which states and their reserve powers may differ from one state to the other when it comes to protecting health, safety, lives, and property? What might be considered a correct interpretation of this that would not be the same in another state? And I'll give you a couple of examples here. And one would deal with what's referred to as the dangerous dog ordinance. So here we can think about health and safety, looking at breed-specific laws. So the states in red, they enforce breed-specific laws, and there are no state laws prohibiting breed-specific laws. So in those states, local governments could come up with city ordinances that could ban particular dog breeds. The states in black, there is not a breed-specific law. So there we can see a difference among the states. It doesn't mean that a city would necessarily have that, but it's possible that they could. And so that a particular dog breed could be banned. We're probably interpreting this the way that it generally applies. We're looking at, of course, large aggressive dogs. The pit bull is the one that comes to mind in most cases, but perhaps even a dog like a Chow, a German Shepherd, Doberman might be in the Rottweiler, could be in those cases there as well. So you do have some home rule exemptions in the gray states, grandfathered in other words, the law has changed, but it would allow other states to have particular laws that they had at one time that would still apply. There might be some leeway then in those cases. So what we can see here is that some states will have allowances for local governments to be able to ban particular dog breeds, and other states will not do that. And that's an application of police powers and how it varies from one state to the next. We also see here an assisted suicide, what can be referred to as physician-assisted suicide. The states in red have allowed that to happen. The other states have a variety of bans on that. Some have specific laws against it. And then you have some states that have not changed for quite some time. So it is interesting, right, to see a considerable variety there. And does that then lead to the question that this can't be a state issue, that this really needs to be a national issue? And so, as we mentioned, in the issue of gay marriage, ultimately was it has to be a national issue. You can't have a variety of outcomes on that issue. And is this something like that as well, assisted suicide? So while we say there's police power and how states can use that reserve power from the 10th Amendment to regulate people's health and safety and their lives and their property, you also, I think in this case, you can consider that issue about their lives, right? Do people have a right to make this particular decision? And so if it is a case, should people be able to make this decision the same way in every state? And we're not at that case, as we can see here, for both of these areas. This one, of course, certainly a very important and controversial area for sure on people making decisions about their lives. So a couple of examples of the use of police power and the variety that might occur there. So we'll kind of wrap up this chapter by looking at how things have changed with federalism over the years. And maybe this has happened in some ways, certainly through political changes, but also just through demographics, technology, and demand. So on pages 106 through 109, the models of federalism, we can see here that for a good period of time in our history, that there was dual federalism and really not much of a change that would occur. So you would have, again, the interpretation of the Constitution, the use of reserve powers, that you would have the responsibilities of the national government and then responsibilities of the state government, and they really did not intertwine. And so that's why you can see that interpretation of dual federalism. Did that start to then change as you think about where life would be different by the 1930s as compared to the late 1700s? And certainly life was starting to change throughout the 1800s, but even there, you still would have had people traveling through by ship or by horseback, wagon in many ways, although certainly there would have been advancements with trains. But by the 1930s, you're starting to have people travel certainly a lot by automobile, now even by plane. And you have radio, and perhaps even starting to get the advent of television. So does that then suggest that there needs to be a more involved type of system here, where you have cooperative federalism, as we can see there, where you start to have efforts between both the federal government and state government working together to try to solve problems. And in many ways, this is where we see presidents that we can start to associate this with a particular form of federalism. This is suggesting that there is also, though, the federal government is having more authority than state governments in many different areas. And so Franklin Roosevelt becomes the president that is associated with cooperative federalism. Part of that's raised certainly with the Great Depression, the idea then that states are relying upon assistance from the national government to be able to solve the problems that are found in their states, but also in areas such as developing, damming up rivers to create flood control, but also hydroelectricity. And while those are, beneficial, is it a case where you have the federal government starting to really exert some influence on the states? And that becomes even more so with centralized federalism in the 1960s, where it's really top down and the federal government is directing the states. The president that's most associated with that is Lyndon Johnson. He was the president throughout most of that period. So really, your text suggests that it's his presidency that creates that type of federalism. So Lyndon Johnson is the president there to associate with that type of federalism. I think that's a good idea as you're preparing for test, is to look at a particular type of federalism and say, does that associate, is there a president or presidents that you associate with that type of federalism. So the movement to bring more authority back to states and away from the federal government, which while that happened, there were still episodes for both of these presidents in which you started to still see national government making decisions such as new cabinet positions or other major bureaucracies. But for the most part, at least the attitude and the motivation was to move authority back in many cases to states. And that new federalism then can be associated with the presidencies of Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan. And now we see, as mentioned in your text, a very interesting area to look at, and that is the idea of partisan federalism, and that perhaps that's what we're seeing happen now, that federalism is not really driven by policy, but driven by political party. And so do you see in states, in other words, governors of particular political parties, are they more likely to support a president's decisions on federalism, which might increase the role of the federal government within a state when in other areas the governor may not be very supportive of that, but would be if the president is of the same political party as the governor? And that's certainly suggested that we're seeing partisan federalism occur, and perhaps the COVID policy might be a really good example, probably in many cases is, with a few exceptions, where you had Republican governors that were supportive of what the Republican president, President Trump, would have been supportive or not supportive of in COVID policy. And then Democratic governors less supportive or wanting to go a different direction than what we see with a COVID policy, either a more active COVID policy or perhaps a more hands-off type of approach dealing with COVID. So in both cases, it's not really the policy itself, but it's the partisanship of both the governors and then the presidents involved. And so that's an interesting area to read. And, you can certainly reach your own conclusions on whether or not that's a good motivation on making a decision when it comes to federalism. But I think there's some pretty strong evidence that we see that happening in the United States at this time. So that's on pages 107 and 108. We can see here, though, that federal government does have a lot of power, and they have a lot of power because the federal government has a lot of power because it also has a lot of money. And the 16th Amendment, the Income Tax Amendment, does show ways of shifting that money to the federal government, and now having the federal government be able to determine policy. Now, perhaps that's also just really necessary, again, because of the lives that we live today and the changes that are occurring when it comes to demographics, technology, populations, and just innovations that are occurring, that this is the best way to run that is to have a more active federal government. Obviously, not everyone agrees with that, but that may be some other explanations for the power of the federal government. In this case, we're looking at, is it still in the best situation for other states to have a variety of drinking ages? And increasingly then by the 1980s, there became less and less support for having these drinking ages that would vary among the states. And so you have the Drinking Age Act that was in 1984, pressuring states to change their drinking age if they had a drinking age below 21, to raise that drinking age to 21, or they would have a reduction in federal support. And so a great example there of fiscal federalism. And that's referenced on page 110 in your text. And so while we can see that that's, you can argue that's a strong arm activity by the federal government, you can also say, was it necessary because it's better off for the country to have a uniform drinking age? And so those are different ways of looking at fiscal federalism and what it might mean for the country. And last, we'll then look at the power of grants. And this is found here on pages 110 to 112. And you can see here the different kinds of grants. And so there's all kinds of states, local governments, entities within local governments that are applying for grants. NEOA&M certainly uses grants. And so here you can see that they can be beneficial, and you can also read how they differ. So you have the categorical formula grant. It's a narrow purpose. It's based on a formula. So a local government or state government would get that grant if it would fit with that formula. More broadly defined, and as you can see here also, who has the authority? Is it the organization that is bestowing the grant, or is it the organization that's receiving the grant? And you can get a sense that the states would have more authority from block grants, because the block grants are broadly defined policy areas. So if you just say it's a health grant, so then anything related to health, a state may get that grant, but it's then up to the state to decide how that money would be spent. So that's considerably different than if it was narrowly defined and based on a formula. That's the people writing the grant, the boundaries of the grant would have more authority in that case. And then you can see that how you're able to apply for the grant and explain the use of that grant can make the determination on who would receive the grant. So it's competitive. So some organizations, based on how they write the grant or just how they're able to explain their need for the grant, would be in a better situation to receive the grant than some other organization. So those are some of the examples. There's other examples that are mentioned there on pages 110 to 112. So certainly look that area over. All right, we'll wrap up there with federalism from chapter 3. We'll move on to chapter 4 and start looking at the use of the Bill of Rights.